Right, folks. So Bal asked me to do a session for you on professionalism, leadership and team working. And obviously this is a sort of introductory outing into these non-technical and non-clinical domains that we have to put into sort of the basic training, so ST1 and ST2. And obviously these will all get built on over the next 5 or 6 years as you complete your clinical training towards your CCT. So just so that you know, during the next hour and a quarter or so, we'll be covering material that you can potentially use and pin to your SIPs 1, 3, 5, 6 and 7. So when you go back into your portfolios, hopefully it'll cover it. I will try to send this as a PDF to Bal. It keeps telling me it's too big for her inbox, so I might have to do a little bit of editing to get it small enough for it to slide under the cyber wires. So what we're going to cover in the next 75 minutes or so are our 4 main learning objectives, which is a little bit about understanding what the regulator, in other words, for us, that's the GMC, mean about professionalism, highlighting sort of what's in your e-portfolio that you might need to link this morning's efforts to. I'll show you a little bit about where the Learn to Lead toolkit is on the Thames Valley HEE pages. And I will declare a vested interest. I was one of the 3 authors of it. And then we'll do probably the bit that's the most fun bit before lunch, which is a little bit of gaining some insight into diversity, human factors, and we'll touch on a little bit about differential attainment at that point too. So we'll do the first objective, which is what does the regulator mean? Well, in simple terms, what this means in practice is that we turn up to work on time, and when we turn up to work, we are not just on time, but we're ready to work. So if your shift starts at 8 o'clock, you are in the handover room at 8 o'clock, appropriately dressed, not parking your car, wandering, past ANT in Reading, for example, for a cup of coffee, and sort of strolling in for handover at about 8:15, on time and ready. During Bal's talk earlier this morning, we've talked about working collaboratively with colleagues from as part of multidisciplinary teams, but it's also all service backgrounds, so that you work well with sonographers, midwives, maternity care assistants. Probably as you come through training, that you might broaden that term colleague out to patient representative groups, patient voice groups, who will provide you with brutally honest feedback on the service. Clearly, in the last 2 years, if you're sick, following the pathways for notification of absence, but they've always applied. But the number of people who ring up and leave a message with any random human being rather than following their departmental guidelines are quite surprising. And also people who tell you that they're not really sure, but they might be okay to do a night in a couple of days' time, but they'll give you a phone call at 5 o'clock tomorrow, which is probably a bit late. Obviously, if you see something that upsets you in behaviours, beg your pardon, interactions with your colleagues, do speak up. Because if you think that somebody is being bullied and you're observing, you could ask them how they feel. And rather than going, oh, it's just disgraceful, but Mr. X has always done that. Ask them how upset they are. Do they need to speak to somebody? Could they speak to their supervisor? Should they speak to the director of medical education? And the orangey one, if you've left something unfinished, and we all get to the end of shift and we haven't tidied everything up, it's making sure that you have done a very specific handover to somebody, not a person who's got the skills and know-how to make sure that whatever hasn't been done will happen either in the next 2 or 3 hours, or remember to hand it over at 8 o'clock the next morning if it's something that can't be done overnight. And actually, I don't know about you, but I don't think that any of these are really unreasonable asks or difficult asks. But unfortunately, you will come across in your career, and you might already have done, people who don't do these sorts of things. They might be your peers, they might be near peers, so perhaps some registrars or senior registrars you work with. And I fully accept that you might have even seen these behaviours from time to time in some consultants. But, you know, that's what being professional is. Now, if we turn the clock back to about 2015-16, which feels a very long time ago now, the GMC hosted a series of events with all of these stakeholders in the white banner. So the BMA, NHS employers, the Care Quality Commission, who are most doctors' favourite visitors, but also large bodies involved in specialty and healthcare sort of regulations. As well. So they didn't ask our college, but then we're relatively small. You know, remember, only 3% of graduates are obs and gynae doctors. Most doctors fall under the banners of surgeons, GPs or physicians. But they had 6 actual events, because this was 2015, around the UK. And they invited an online contribution to ask doctors what the challenges were that face the modern doctor, those of us who were working in the early 21st century. And they looked at 6 topics: ethics, resilience, collaboration, compassion, scholarship, and patient safety. And you might be sitting there thinking, they sound a little bit SIPS, because that's what struck me. And of course, this was just before the launch of some other bits that we'll come on to. So they produced a document that you can find online that's got this hideous lime green flavouring, called Medical Professionalism Matters. And it was a report with some recommendations, not just for us as individuals in our professional lives, but for the organisations we work within and the bodies that we might liaise with. And they added to that a whole load of little delights, like the doctor's dilemma, the collaborative doctor. The doctor is a scholar with all our lifelong learning and continued professional development. I've lost my mouse. Oh, there he is. Right. The compassionate doctor, because we're all supposed to be lovely and kind and compassionate and not get burnt out. And I don't know where my mouse keeps doing weird things. And the resilient doctor, which of course is important. So if you want to know where that came from, it came here, and this is why I'll try and send these to you, so you can find it on the GMC website. But within that survey of the 600 doctors who turned up face to face and the 400 who contributed online, these were some of the findings. And they might help some of you feel a little bit more reassured about your own practice. So as many as 80% of doctors might be unsure that they've made the right decision at times. Most of us agreed that there were limits to patient confidentiality, and sometimes you do have to share information that they've disclosed to you. Clearly, if it's in their best interests, you have to. Slightly worryingly, I think, 58% weren't sure that they would be supported if they gave, a bit of whistleblowing to go on. So then I found this one quite surprising, that 70% felt that multidisciplinary working had been overstated as a panacea. 40% say some doctors' attitudes undermine respect and prevent effective collaboration. Well, that's not great if you're trying to do multidisciplinary and patient-centred care. And on patient-centred care, 3/4 of us thought that we were making reasonable efforts to share the decision-making with our patients. I think if we went out today and asked these questions 2 years into the pandemic, I think these numbers would be different. 85% of doctors said they weren't always able to prioritise patient safety. And that's possibly including quality improvement projects and such like, because 22% said that they were rarely or ever able to prioritise that. And certainly in the last 2 years, projects that might have been a slightly academic exercise have certainly been kind of thrown by the wayside, although lots of on-the-hoof quality improvement projects and patient safety work hasn't necessarily been done. And you know, this is sort of 15, 16 kind of attitude times. And then 67% of doctors say they do not have the time to pursue scholarly activities. Now, I don't know exactly what the question asked was, but that is, you know, doctors in training turning up for teaching to help address their curriculum needs, and doctors who are no longer in training doing sufficient CPD, which for all doctors in all specialties is about 50 hours a year or 1 hour a week of something where you can learn. And that can include turning up to, you know, morbidity and mortality meetings. It usually doesn't include just reading the BMJ or the Lancet. But what they did find was that the greatest pressure on doctors comes from us, ourselves. And that's because, unfortunately, most of us have perfectionist tendencies. And if you just think about yourself for a moment, almost certainly you had a slew of A's and A stars for your GCSE exams, for your A levels, or if you did international baccalaureate, you probably scored in the very high, you know, 39 plus on your IB. You're perhaps more likely to be in that 2/3 of people who pass their driving test first time. You probably at school were quite good at playing an instrument or sport. You know, we were seen at school as being relatively golden, and then you get to medical school and discover everybody else is, which can be a bit of a dent to your confidence. But by and large, we don't expect to fail. And the first time most of us experience failure is around our Royal College exams. And even then, some people manage to pass all of those first time. So we're tough on ourselves a lot of the time. So thinking about now, we've got Joe Public, who believes that he or she pays a chunk of their salary as national insurance contributions, which they believe is money that directly goes to the health service. Oh golly, how naive they are. We had the toe curling bit of clapping for carers in early 2020 when they said to us, you know, you're all marvellous and thank you for saving our lives and we must protect you because we haven't got a vaccine and we're all going to die from COVID. And then they seemingly found it was quite difficult to get into their GP surgeries. And that there was quite a lot of talk that if you went into hospital, you were going to catch COVID. And this headline was actually December 2020, so 13, 14 months ago. And there are graphs to show that people were indeed contracting COVID once they were inpatients. But presumably that is because there was insufficient space between beds. It might be due to the testing of NHS staff only twice a week. And of course, this was just before vaccine rollout, that headline. 6 days ago, that was a headline in The Guardian, 6 million people are waiting for routine hospital treatment in England. That's not quite true. It's about 5.3 million if you go to NHS waitlist. And this was in the Birmingham Live newspaper just a fortnight ago, saying that people who were going into Wolverhampton's New Cross Hospital were waiting in their emergency department for in excess of 12 hours. So there's an awful lot of media, I'm going to say bashing of us at the moment, saying, you know, that you can't get to see a doctor, you go into hospital, they're not clean, everybody's hiding, why can't we get healthcare? and people can't take family members to physical appointments in many services, in many hospitals still. All of that might change, of course, in the next 6 months, but feeling that we've sort of retreated behind closed doors and they're rather less friendly towards us than they used to be. So it's a bit tough out there. So those 6 factors that the Professionalism Matters project looked at in 15-16 inevitably fed into the generic professional capabilities document, which was published, I'm going to say, in about 2018-19. This is the one against which all of the colleges, and certainly ours, have mapped our sort of progress through our time in training, and indeed how we should continue to behave as consultants. And so there are 9 domains which I've listed there, which you've probably, if asked, most of you could probably manage 3, 4, 5 of them. If you like lists, that's one format for it. And again, you can find this on the GMC's website. If you prefer kind of pictures, the 9 are in here, putting our professional values and behaviours sort of at our core. And then within our skills, they've put those 6 things around it. So I'm going to go anti-clockwise. So our health promotion and illness prevention, we've talked about that this morning, about opportunistic conversations around vaccinations, around screening. You could think about it with our midwives around dietary advice that they might give pregnant women at a booking appointment. Lifestyle choices that we might discuss with our patients. We're thinking about leadership and team working right now. We've had a little bit of a think this morning about patient safety, quality improvement, working in MDTs, producing joint guidelines for patients, perhaps. We all know about safeguarding of vulnerable groups. As obstetricians and gynecologists, we have to do child protection. I'm sure you've all done your adult safeguarding and deprivation of liberty training that we all have to do. You as trainees are very much into your education and training at the moment, but that will continue forever. And research and scholarship. Not everybody's going to do a PhD or an MD. That's not what this is about. This is about where can I find the information, what projects or studies might I be able to do in my place of work that are clinically relevant, that again could improve the patient experience or patient safety or multidisciplinary team working. So, most of us will produce some stuff that is presented locally. You might have stuff that's published in journals. Some of you will take time out and do a DPhil or an MD or a master's degree, because that's what we do as doctors. So that's kind of where the GMC think we need to be. So it's all very well saying that, but we have to be able to prove that. And I suspect that most of you won't remember Rebecca Black when she was head of school before Debbie Harrington. But Rebecca said, and she's an associate dean now, the whole thing is that we've got to be able to put it in our portfolio. And actually, even as a consultant, and Val will vouch for this, you have to be able to put this sort of stuff in your annual appraisal for your revalidation and your license to practice. If for those of you that think that putting stuff in your portfolio is a bit of a pain in the arse, yes, it is, but you're going to be doing it forever. So I think you've somehow got to come up with a system to be able to capture that. So our current curriculum from the college outlines 14 SIPs for an obs and gynae doctor. And as I said right at the beginning of the talk, we've got material, certainly this morning, that addresses elements of 5 of those 14 SIPs, which is quite handy. So you know about professional values, so that's SIP 1. We're thinking about that, and we know that we're the mission statement, if you like, is to provide high quality and safe patient-centred care. So that's cool. We're going to do a little bit about leadership, and I'm going to show you some tools in a moment that will help you demonstrate at least nascent development as a leader, and how you can engage and how you can deliver. I'm going to talk a little tiny bit about human factors before we finish, and something around individual team and team behaviours. 6 and 7, which is the research scholar educator bit of being a doctor. Again, an awareness of yourself will help you take an active role in others, and you might get some, you might even have had as well, some teaching around reflection and personal development. You've probably all had a little bit of an introduction to critical appraisal, to be able to read papers, journal clubs, that sort of thing, that you can stick in for SIP 7. And the rest of it we're not really covering this morning, but certainly is going to get covered during your progress through the programme. So let's think about leadership and learning to lead. And I can think back a few years to one of the consultants in our team at Reading, and to be fair, Bal, you were still a trainee, so I'm going back a few years, who in a meeting we had as a department with our chief executive said, well, our leaders are the care group director and whoever is the clinical lead for our department. And they said this without any malice and seemingly no naivety. And Steve, who's our chief exec, looked at this person and said, no, every single one of you is a leader. All consultants are leaders. And this colleague of ours was a little bit surprised. And you know, leadership we all do to a greater or lesser extent. And you don't get it by doing a 2-day course as an ST6 or ST7 or a week-long course at the University of Kiel. And certainly most people aren't going to go and join the faculty for leadership and management in the NHS. 1 or 2 people might, but most of you won't. So what we have to do is think about how can we engage doctors in the early years of their career to begin to develop some skills around leadership. So about 2017, 3 of us set about developing a toolkit with the Thames Valley and Wessex Leadership Academy. So that was Maggie Woods, Jane Hazelgrove, who was my counterpart down in Wessex, and I developed a toolkit for doctors in training across both Wessex and Thames Valley. And then more recently, Kent, Surrey, Sussex have adopted this. But there is this website that you can see here. So it is in the Thames Valley Deanery website. And it's the Learning to Lead Toolkit. And it's actually really quite, it is quite interactive. If you go into it, there are live links that will take you to TED Talks, to bits of the NHS Leadership Development website with exercises. It tells you you can read information about the Edward Jenner Leadership Programme, which is free to use and web-based and is suitable for all professionals working in healthcare. The Jenner and Mary Seacole programmes, which you may have heard of, were launched around about 2012-2013. They were bespoke for NHS professionals. They're not exclusive to doctors, because part of the initiative was to get physiotherapists and pharmacists and nurses and literally everybody involved in thinking about how we can work within teams to enhance the patient experience, improve patient safety and such like, and actually work collaboratively with each other to get the best outcomes. And it's online. Hands up, yeah, I did it in about 2013 because I wanted to see what it looked like, because we actually recommended it as a stream for doctors in training at that point in time. But there's an awful lot more that's become available since about 2013, which is how we developed this Learning to Lead toolkit in sort of 17, 18. So that might be something that would be at least worth clicking on to save as a bookmark to go back and have a look at. We have stratified it so you can see what things we think are really worth doing at ST1-2, but it also will help you see what we felt would be appropriate for sort of the middle years of training as well as the final years. And of course, you'll have to do your 2-day management course in ST6 and 7 because our college said you've got to do it. And the deanery provide that, and it's free. So that's that little bit there. So let's think about gaining insight into our diverse teams and human factors. So hopefully you can all see my screen. So what I'm going to do now is we're going to do an exercise, and I am going to count 30 seconds. In a moment, I'm going to share the next slide with you, and I want you to look at it for 30 seconds. And if you can, if you've got a pen and paper or your phone, jot down a few notes about what you are looking at, because then hopefully we will be able to discuss these within the group. And this is actually quite fun, but it's also really quite fascinating. So here comes your picture, and your 30 seconds starts now. Okay, right, you've had your 30 seconds. I'm not going to make it disappear. Val, are you able to see people's hands up?
I can see their hands if they go up.
Can you pick on people for me and ask a few of them to tell all of us what they've taken away from that picture?
Okay, Amelia.
Hi, Amelia.
Well, I can see that it's on a river. It looks like a nice day. The water's calm and there are lots and lots of boats, maybe some sort of event. There's a bit of smoke. I don't know if one of them's crashed. Yeah.
Thank you. Vinod?
Vinod.
Looks like St. Paul's, flotilla of barges on the Thames, I'm assuming.
Okay.
Matt?
Yeah, there's a big flotilla. One of the ships looks, I thought it fired a cannon or something. Otherwise, it looks like quite a nice celebratory event, but I don't know if perhaps there's a war.
Okay.
Alia?
Okay.
I thought it was all quite pleasant, and it's a nice spring or summer day, and it made me want to travel again after a long period of COVID, and gave me vibes about Venice and the Thames and the River Seine in Paris. I got quite nice vibes from it.
Thank you. Lucy?
Yeah, I also thought about Venice and sort of like travel. I thought it seems like quite a nice, calm day, but probably some sort of celebration going on.
Kerith?
I thought it looked like kind of a royal parade, like we had for the Queen's Diamond Jubilee, like the big golden flotilla, the Union Jack flags, kind of a nice, sunny, joyous occasion, people coming out to celebrate.
Any more, Jane? Or
well, I mean, that's quite interesting. I mean, two of you said that there were sort of you had a sort of slightly Venetian feel to the composition of this picture. So I'm going to tell you now that it was painted in 1747 by Canaletto, who actually came to England for 2 or 3 years and did quite a lot of studies of the River Thames. Of course, he was a Venetian artist. And in fact, you know, most of you picked up that it was quite a nice day. One of you said that that looked to you rather like St Paul's Cathedral, so well done there. It was actually the Lord Mayor's Day, and there was a procession of the ceremonial barges, which you can see there's two right in the middle of the image, one with a red roof, one with a green roof, as they came past St Paul's, and lots of small rowboats were out on the river following the procession. And this, towards the right hand side, you can see that there's another rather fancy ceremonial barge with a red roof, and nearer the foreground, again on the right hand side, there's yet another ceremonial barge with a sort of very dark blacky green roof. I've always wondered what the one with the black sails cutting across the direction of traffic is doing, and whether that's simply a trades boat trying to cross from all those rather rickety looking warehouses in front of St Paul's Cathedral to cross from one side of the Thames to the other, because there were very few bridges in 1747. But in my head, one of that almost struck me as, in a slightly different setting in the modern day, that's a little bit like a boat trying to cross the English Channel with all the shipping traffic. Because, as you know, the English Channel is one of the busiest waterways in the world, and we have lots of desperate people trying to cross in tiny little boats in the midst of great big boats and risking their lives. I don't know what that smoky thing is. I don't think they will have fired a cannon, but it is possible that somebody's fired a blunderbuss or something like that. The other thing that struck me was that in my head I had thought that it was 1647, so a whole 100 years earlier, and I'm thinking that's the wrong St Paul's, because the Great Fire of London was 1666, and so obviously Sir Christopher Wren, as many of us know, built the new St Paul's Cathedral, which has this very characteristic profile. But again, in the background, you can see at least 4 or 5 spires of other Wren churches that were built after the Fire of London. So, yes, I spent more than 30 seconds looking at this, but we didn't all quite describe the same thing. You know, and if you listen to what everyone had said for your 30-second glance, it was ever so slightly different. Some people picked up details that others didn't mention, possibly because they weren't as important to those people, and that is fine. So now I'm going to introduce you to a concept known as the Rashomon effect. And there is a silly little cartoon there, but we'll go round the people on this elephant in turns. So if we start off with the fat person with the blindfold on, standing at the front of the elephant with a finger pointing at the tusk, he can't see the elephant, but he's felt the tusk, which is probably quite sharp at the end. And so whatever the object is he's feeling, he thinks it might be a spear. Somebody else who is sat up on the top of the elephant is feeling its ear, which is big and flappy, and moving air around. And that person thinks that what they're sort of in contact with is a fan. Why not? That's why elephants flap their ears, isn't it? To keep themselves cool. Whoever's round the back end of the elephant, I mean, they're all wearing blindfolds. What they can feel is the elephant's tail, which has a slightly rope-like quality to it. So they think that what they're being asked to identify is a rope. There's somebody in a red outfit near the front, groping round a very stout leg. around the elephant's elbow, in fact. So it's a bit rough and it might feel a bit like bark. So I think that's probably a she, has decided that what she's being faced with is a tree. Someone's feeling the trunk and thinks that it might be a snake, because of course the end of an elephant's trunk is really quite tactile, and it might feel a bit like a snake. And somebody, the guy up the ladder, they've just got a massive expanse of hide in front of them that feels all a bit rough, and they think it's a wall. So if you can only see what's immediately in front of you, what this suggests is that you describe what you think is there in your field of vision. And that's fine. I mean, the name came from this film that was made 70 years ago. But why is it important to be aware of this in emergency situations, or shall we say, when something goes wrong at work?
I guess being able to empathize with people who might be thinking in a different way to you, or
Absolutely.
especially when we're looking back on things that have gone wrong, I think it's really easy to look back on something and be like, well, obviously this was what was going on, but being able to appreciate that everyone might be looking at something from a different point of view is important.
And that actually their viewpoint is no less valid than yours, I think, is the important thing as well. So it's that we might see things slightly differently depending on where we're standing. I mean, I used to do the 2 or 3 people all standing over a 5-bar gate looking, you know, across a lovely bucolic view, and we would all pick out slightly different things in the landscape. I mean, you've all done a little bit of simulation training now, I'm sure, and you see different people in a group, you know, on a prompt day or that sort of thing, and their experience might not be the same as yours. And there's if any of you have come across the organisation Civility Saves Lives, I don't know whether you have. It was set up by an emergency department consultant called Chris Turner, who worked in the Midlands. In fact, he worked at North Staffordshire Hospital when that existed. But there's some quite good stuff from him on YouTube. He's done a TED talk, but he did one at Morecambe Bay, which of course is the trust responsible for the Barrow-in-Furness maternity scandals, the Kirkup report, which you might have heard of. Chris is a Scottish emergency department physician who is white, and by his own admission is short and a bit portly. And during his talk, he tells you that his wife is a Welsh lady of Bengali heritage who likes to spend a lot of money. And he said, I could not presume to know what it feels like to be my wife. And it was said with a lot of humour and a lot of love, but it's actually a really important thing. And thinking about this morning when Bal was talking about Black and Asian women and women from other ethnic minorities may have a greater risk of an adverse maternity outcome than somebody who is a white British service user. That, you know, it's how do we make a service that works for them, that fits in with their cultural values, and doesn't frighten them. So that's something that we all perhaps need to think about. And I think in our specialty, we have always attracted quite a high number of international medical graduates, specifically women, who come to the UK for a period of training and who may possibly return to the country they were born in later. We don't have a lot of men. It's lovely to see that there are some of you here today, but it's interesting because we're quite different to an awful lot of other specialties in hospital care. So I'm just going to move on now to thinking about differences, but these are differences between doctors rather than our patients. Something that the GMC have been very interested in big time for about the last 4 or 5 years is this concept of something called differential attainment. And there are 5 key kind of factors that we need to think about when we're talking about this topic. It's politically really important, and it's something that's considered to be incredibly important for particularly doctors working in postgraduate medical education, as well as in medical schools, to be aware of. And it's that some people will have a slower training progression than most people. And I'm not talking about an arithmetic mean. I'm not talking about, let's use our specialty. It's a 7-year run through. It's not that some people take 10 because they go off to do a PhD. It's not because some people will take 12 years because they do some of their training at less than full time, or they've had some maternity leave, or they've had a prolonged illness from which they need to recover. It's that these are people who show up every day to get to work, but it might be that they didn't get into an ST1 job when they did their first round of specialty application. It's not that they didn't apply, it's that they applied but weren't successful. Maybe that there are people who have multiple goes at part 1 or part 2 or part 3 exams. Part 3 is a bit difficult to fail, it has to be said, but they have multiple goes, and of course you can't progress up the training ladder without passing exams. They might have fewer opportunities to develop skills to become a leader. And research by a lady called Kath Wolfe, who is based at University College in London, who was commissioned by the GMC to do the research. And she did an awful lot of interviews of doctors, was around how they experience their training environment. And that's one of the things that the Dean does with his deanery visits and various questionnaires that educators have to fill in every year, and DMEs. And it's this whole equality and equity kind of conversation there. So does anybody, and again, Bal, if you're still with us, does anybody know what the difference between equality and equity of access is? Anybody?
Let me see, there is a hand up.
Anybody?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Come on, be brave.
yeah, no. So equality is effectively the same treatment for everybody.
Yeah.
So the example we use is everybody gets a stool to help to make them taller. Whether you're 5 foot tall or 6'7", you get a stool.
Okay.
Equity is individualized treatment for everyone to make things equal. So if you're 5 foot, you get a stool that will make you a foot taller. If you are 6 foot, you don't get a stool.
Yeah.
If you're 6'7", we dig a hole that's 7 inches deep so that everybody's the same height.
Absolutely, absolutely brilliantly explained. So what we need is equity of access. So it's giving people what they need to get the experience they deserve. And so obviously for patients that's treatment, but for us as doctors, it's to make sure that not that we bend rules to suit certain individuals, which is sometimes how it is seen, but that we make sure that everybody gets the same opportunity of access and help that is proportionate to them. So that's really important. And the other thing that's important, having talked to doctors around differential attainment, is the ability to see role models. So we'll come on to this in a moment, but it's people like me. There was some stuff in the newspapers yesterday suggesting that UCAS is actively looking to get rid of the personal statement. So I mean, you guys are all probably still young enough to remember 7-8 years ago when you were possibly filling in your application to get into university, and the hideous 4,000 words or 47 lines you had to write to sell yourself and demonstrate how dead keen you were to be a doctor. And it looks like it might go. And sitting reading some of the underlying comments in the Times yesterday, it was saying that children who had gone to the local comp frequently wrote fairly crap personal statements and were disadvantaged against the 7% of school leavers whose parents had paid for them to go to a fee-paying establishment. And those from the 93% who'd been to state schools were often littered with spelling and grammatical mistakes. And you're sort of thinking, well, surely any sixth former applying, even in a state school, and you know, I have a son who has taught science in a state school, is that they need to be encouraged to show them to you know, a team of teachers who are involved in helping support university applications to make sure that, you know, the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed, and you know, they've used words appropriately, because most people write ones that are too long. But also there was a suggestion that, you know, for certain courses, more middle class parents might have contacts within their social circles to get work experience, which you've got to put in your personal statement. And certainly Kath Wolf's research has suggested that if you are let's say a female from the Sudan and you come to work in the UK as a doctor, there frankly are not very many Sudanese female doctors working in the UK, let alone one in your specialty and in your training region. So where might your natural mentor be, or where might be that role model that you look at and think, she's me but 10 years older, I can, if she's done it, I can do that. You know, I don't know whether any of you have had those conversations with yourself at all. I remember when I qualified, which was 1984, when you have to remember that less than half of medical school graduates were female. It was a quarter of us were women. And I had a registrar in my, what was effectively my F1 job, who was a married woman who was a registrar in obs and gynae. And I looked at Joan and I thought, if she can do it, so can I, because she had got married as an F1, which is what I had done. And she had, by the time I met her, she'd already passed her FRCS and MRCOG exams. She was about 32. I was 24. And I thought, well, if she can do it, so can I. Because lots of, you know, most of the people that I saw were men. Or unmarried women, because the two consultants at the Royal Free when I graduated were both unmarried women. And it was very much a message of, if you want to be a consultant, you can't be a wife. Joan actually never had children. I've got two. But it's seeing it to sort of think, yes, this could be me, which, you know, might be really important. So now this might be a bit controversial, but I'm going to suggest to you that differential attainment isn't unique to doctors from any particular ethnicity or religion. And it is a term that is usually applied to international medical graduates, but it can present in people who are British born and educated. It can present in people who on the face of it should have all the advantages in that they're white, and they might even have got themselves into the University of Oxford and graduated with their medical degree there. Because I have seen people who live with, shall we say, neurodiverse conditions. I'm aware of certainly two doctors who were diagnosed with quite surprising dyslexia, shall we say, in their mid-30s, one of whom had already done had taken time out to do a master's, but interestingly had repeatedly failed their specialty exams because of time, obviously the time constraints there, and were then you know, he took himself off and got diagnosed as being dyslexic. He also was in a specialty where you needed quite a lot of planning and spatial awareness, and his psychologist's report suggested that these were things he really had to work on quite hard. It actually matched brilliantly with quite a lot of the feedback he'd had from his trainers about how he really struggled with certain aspects of his specialty. It's a great shame, because I think if he'd been diagnosed 10 years earlier, he would have gone into a different specialty and found it much easier. He spent 16 years getting his CCT, which is kind of mind-blowing, I think. So moving on from differential attainment and thinking about valuing diversity and giving a voice and all of this, you know, we're each as valid as the other. I'm going to do a little bit about groupthink. So I'm going to pop up a few pictures. You might have heard of things around conscious bias. You might have seen things around unconscious bias and assumptions. And have any of you come across an economics Nobel laureate called Daniel Kahneman? No. No? Silence. You've all gone to sleep. Well, he's dead now, but he died quite recently. But he came out with the concept. He wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow. And actually, the first half of it's quite a good read if you're interested in human factors and behaviours, because his background originally was in psychology. But conscious bias is when you deliberately make a choice. That's thinking slow. And unconscious bias is it happens so quickly that there is no conscious thought about it. And I'm going to show you some pickies in a minute. And we're all good at making assumptions based on the information. Thinking back to the elephant cartoon, based on what is visible to you, you make a story. Or the Canaletto print. You've had a brief look at it. You've seen things. You've developed a narrative. So, whoops, it should be that. So that's a little group of various males, females, and possibly people who want to identify somewhere in between, wearing different types of clothing, different skin tones, different hairstyles, and there may be somebody in that group that looks a bit like you, and there may not be. But you know, sometimes people say, oh, they live on my road, or we went to the same medical school, or we were in the same training program, and therefore their experience is similar to mine, therefore they must be like me. What's it doing now? Right, so here we have a photograph of three fairly young looking men standing beside, that's actually the Sydney Harbour, and the bridge in Sydney Harbour. So again, a little bit like the Canaletto, if we look at them, yeah, three lads, the one with the sleeveless t-shirt, I don't like sleeveless t-shirts, he looks like he's got quite muscly arms. The one in the middle with his baseball cap, don't much like baseball caps. So you might be thinking, oh Christ, Jane's really, really biased. I actually know these three. They're all professional rugby players. They all played for England Sevens. And two of those three are in this photograph because they were part of our team who qualified for the Tokyo Olympics. And one of them is actually my daughter's partner. But, you know, if we were going back, you sort of think, oh, actually, do I find any of those attractive? I won't tell you which one's hers. But yeah, so that's those. So let's go back. Now, look at the little cartoon at the bottom. That's one of Daniel Kahneman's little cartoons. And this is around assumptions. So he uses the example of a young student called Julie. And the only fact he's going to give you about Julie is that she was able to read fluently at the age of 4. So again, inviting some of you to just chip in and just blurt it out. If you saw Julie and you knew that about her, which is akin to saying, oh, they must be good because they read medicine at Oxford, or, oh, they're not very good because they graduated from one of the newer medical schools, let's say East Anglia or Brighton. How true is that?
I hope it's not very true because I graduated from East Anglia.
Okay. Well, you might think on that one small fact for Julie, we'll take the medical schools out of it. But if she could read fluently at 4, she was clearly a very bright young lady. and that she was very likely to get into a university that has, shall we say, an academic pedigree. So we might say Oxbridge, we might say Russell Group. All of these things make me shudder. And that you might expect her to get a very good degree at the end of it. So, you know, not only an academic course, but possibly getting a first or certainly a 2-1. But what you might not know about Julie is that she developed quite significant eating disorders and as a teenager, and actually had to take a year out of university and spent some time in you know, a residential eating unit, and has not yet fully recovered. So, you know, with limited information, and that might be about, you know, I remember, again, when my kids were at school, I did a sort of a group thing for people applying to medical school. And there was one lad sitting there whose dad was apparently a plastic surgeon at King's. And he kind of sort of sprawled back rather theatrical and said, oh, my father says that he will always interview people who are King's graduates, you know, to work on his team. And this was in the days when you literally chucked an application in individually and took potlucks, kind of how I came through training. And I said to him, but that doesn't work anymore because you put them in and you get shortlisted against criteria. And if you've hit the criteria, you get interviewed. And the people interviewing you have no idea which medical school you went to. And you've all been through the selection process, so you know that in the stations, other than the portfolio one, nobody knows anything about you. You know, they don't know where you went. So I think you're absolutely right. It does not matter whether you went to Oxford, East Anglia, Brighton, Sheffield, Manchester, nor indeed should it be if you graduated overseas. Which brings us on to the next one. So culture has many layers, so simply little Russian dollies. But if you sit and spend time on the exercise, and I'm conscious of where we're at with time, but we are nearly there, there are lots of things that inform those layers that make us who we are. So if we start at the top and go round, it's which, you know, what's your nationality? And in some parts of the world, there may be significant differences between the region within a country where you grow up. Again, around the world, your ethnic group, even in the country you were born in, may have an impact on how you see life. It may also have an impact on your opportunities to access certain experiences. Religion may be important. For example, in Egypt, I've been told by a couple of Egyptian colleagues that if you are Christian, there is still discrimination against you as a Christian in a largely Muslim country, and that you may not get into certain universities or medical schools because you are Christian. And whilst that doesn't happen in the UK, it does happen in other parts of the world. In some parts of the world, you are still at a relative disadvantage if you are female in accessing certain roles or certain opportunities. But also, a woman in the main doesn't know what it's like to be a man, and vice versa. Your family and the level of education you attain also impact on how you look at life. You know, if you think back to your hobbies and activities that you did as a kid growing up, there's a reasonable chance that some of the things that you got into were things that your mum or dad did. And the obvious example is Saturday morning football with little boys, isn't it? In that there are lots of clubs for little boys on Saturday mornings, and if you look at the touch lines, it's absolutely littered with blokes clutching a cup of coffee, watching, you know, little Johnny and little Ahmed running around. If you know, one of my oldest friends is a British-born Sikh, and she never learnt to swim because her mum and dad didn't swim, and so she and her brother and sister never had swimming lessons. And so when she had her kids, she made them have swimming lessons, and then she also learnt to swim herself as a 30-something-year-old adult. She said, well, I mean, mum and dad just didn't. None of us did. Your profession is a huge chunk of who you are. My dentist said that when she was on maternity leave, she didn't quite know who she was anymore, because what she wasn't was a dentist, 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. She went back. We all joke about trauma and orthopaedic surgeons being different to us. But, there's organisations, certainly my children who are in their 20s still, they're a different generation to me, and they've had different life experiences to the ones I grew up with. And I'm sure you look at your parents and think, well, their lives were different. I mean, we didn't have anything that we could stream. I mean, even when you guys were children, you couldn't stream stuff. I mean, we had video and DVD players and CD machines, and then iPods, very large ones. Well, we had Sony Walkmans that came in when I was 19, so that's over 40 years ago. Completely different. And so an awareness and appreciation of that is that we've all come to where we are today with a different backstory, and their backstory is valid to them, but it does inform how we experience the world. Now, I think Bal invited all of you to go to this website sort of over the last 2 or 3 weeks.
Oh, Jane, sorry, I completely forgot.
Did you? Okay. Well, you might want to go and do this because it's free. So what we'll do now is I'm going to show you, there are some of you have heard of Myers-Briggs, presumably. Yes, no? Talking nonsense, Jane.
Yes.
Anyway,
Yeah.
it's suggested by Kathleen Myers and her mother that there are 16 fundamental different personality types that show, that are informed by our preferred styles of doing things. Anyway, if you go to 16 personalities, which you're very welcome to do, you can do your own if you haven't done it, and it will give you quite a reasonable modern Myers-Briggs sort of sketch, if you like, of sort of how you see and function in the world, and because of the things that you find your default mode for a situation. I am in Myers-Briggs, I'm an INTJ. So I stands for relatively introverted. So actually, I don't get energized by being in huge groups of people and bouncing ideas around. I like to go away and think about it quietly. And when my batteries need recharging, I'm very happy to do that by myself. But some people, when they've had a bad day and they need their batteries recharging, want to share it with everybody. I'm quite intuitive, apparently, and I spend a lot of time thinking. So I've got quite a lot of that kind of analytical type behaviour in my personality, and that's fine. I realise most of you don't know me. Bal's known me for years, and Ebbs has come across me, and you can see that kind of, for me, a bit of architecturing and logician and commanding, unfortunately. The J is massively planning. I plan. I can't bear to go on holiday without everything being not only loaded on my phone, but I've got printed copies of everything, COVID passes, boarding cards, all that shit. And I know exactly how I'm going to get from the airport to wherever it is I'm staying, because I booked it in advance. And my friend Helen, who was a consultant in Reading, we were talking earlier this week, and I said her daughter's just flown to Costa Rica, and she said, oh, they booked a hotel 4 hours away from the airport, but their flight was rescheduled and was landing later. And she said, Gilly, you can't. She's a specialty trainee in London. You can't you can't be travelling 4 hours to your hotel after you land at 8 o'clock at night in Costa Rica. This is ridiculous. And I said, but Helen, you used to do that. She said, no, only in places like Canada and America, not kind of foreign scary places. So, you know, we and in a team, you actually could probably do with all of these people, or certainly a cross selection. It gets rid of groupthink, because we all bring a slightly different perspective and a diverse take on things. So that might be quite good. There's another one. I don't like this one, 365 tests and colour. But the reason I'm showing you this one is they've got those kind of 4 groups that have been subdivided into 4 groups each. They've just kept them big 4 groups, which they've given colours to. But it shows that on a good day, somebody who is in, let's look at the green one, who is caring and encouraging and sharing and patient and relaxed. And that might be, do you know what, a really lovely doctor with loads of empathy. When they're great and not stressed, that's how they are. But on a bad day, when they're under pressure, they might actually come across as somebody who's a bit plodding, a bit reliant, a bit stubborn, a bit bland. They don't, in that group, look like they're very, you know, on a bad day, they're not very good at leading anything, are they? Perhaps. And, you know, hopefully I'll be able to get these to you as a PDF. These are things that it's just worth having an awareness of the psychology that's out there and how it informs things, and how that might apply to us as we practice. So next one. I know you've got a talk on resilience, or as it's been rebranded in the Deanery, Learning to Thrive, because Bal says that's happening in March. And I think, you know, let's have it out there. The last 2 years have been tough. We all know that, we've lived it. You all did your foundation years before the pandemic arrived. But if you cast your mind back to the summer of 2020, and let's be honest, that's all been in the papers in the last 10 days. But we think about your productivity. So this is sort of March to July 2020. So COVID has arrived. Everything is shut down. The whole nation's in lockdown. People are trying to race to develop vaccines. Hospitals are full of people. This is first wave. And for most people, not just doctors, the end of life as we had known it, sort of up to Christmas 2019, was distinctly behind us. And I think without question, and this is Bridges' model, William Bridges was an American who died quite recently, born in Boston in 1933, Harvard graduate. He's described transition as having 3 zones. So there's the ending, that's the what was there before now. And everybody was fearful and sad as the pandemic started. Some people were in denial, possibly including our current Prime Minister, who didn't think it was as bad as perhaps it turned out to be. There were people who were shocked, there were people who were angry, you know, seriously pissed off, can't go to work, my holiday that I've got booked this year. Hello, it was my 60th birthday, the first day of lockdown. So everything that had been planned to celebrate me being 60 just got binned. I wasn't angry. I was disappointed because I understood it, but I know lots of people were angry that they couldn't go on their holidays. When we get to July, our productivity was dipping a bit in hospital. We were knackered at that point, I think. And that's potentially where you might have seen some people showing symptoms of burnout. But there was a degree of confusion. It's all there. You can read it. But then the first wave had gone away, and we had lots of people talking about, right, all this post-COVID, you know, how marvellous, how exciting, you know, we can change things for the better. And in our department, it stopped the GP out of our service using our clinic rooms was one of them. But the new beginnings was, you know, properly embedding, for example, video consultations with patients as being a way forward. And certainly the managers in the Royal Berks had this daft idea that we could do 30% of antenatal appointments online, midwives or doctors. Well, of course you can't, because there's quite a lot you can't do online. But you can do booking appointments online. You can certainly have conversations about thinking about mode of delivery with people online. And for some of us, that was quite exciting and quite energising. But he came up with this ending neutral and new beginnings. And this was a slide that I have to admit was in a different talk, and I made this in 2020. But it was, you know, we've potentially we might be on the downslope of the third or fourth wave, depending on how you count it. But certainly Omicron looks like it's going away now. You know, it's quite nice until who knows what the next variant of concern might look like. But as you come to the end of it, you know, you might for yourself think about, how did I feel about this? You know, reflecting on your insides, because that might help you make some sense of what we've been through and help you identify whether you're okay or actually whether you're not really okay and could do with a little bit of help. So thinking about, you know, what's behind us and what might come, which for some people might just be a little bit too far to go at the moment, because until it's gone, we don't know that it's gone. It's a little bit like having a menopause. Until you've actually had your last period, you don't know what it feels like to not have periods every month unless you've been pregnant. We're probably in the middle. We're in a sort of neutral zone. We're not quite sure. We think it's probably, well, the wave has ended, but whether the pandemic is, you know, in its last bit, we don't quite know. So at the moment, it feels incredibly chaotic. Particularly last night's announcements, just, you know, you're probably still trying to process them about, you know, masks going and this and that and all the other going. But it can be chaotic, but it might be creative as well. And recognise that, again, that how you feel is incredibly important, but not everybody is necessarily at the same state of mind as you are. So last couple of slides now. So what is the difference between change and transition? I have taken this from William Bridges' work, but change is the external event or situation, and the organisation. So for us, those are the hospitals we've been working in. They focus on some outcomes that the change will produce, and it's, to some extent, it's quite reactive and it might be quite sudden. And again, if we think about, you know, March, April 2020 and all the stuff that was going on in the hospital and comparing that to the place you'd worked in, you know, at Christmas, it was different. There was tumbleweed rolling down the corridors. The press was, you know, people were going to the press saying hospitals are empty. No, the corridors were empty, the waiting rooms, the coffee shops there were empty, but the wards weren't and the staff were at work. But it was weird. Transition is what happens to you or me. It's what happens to us as we go through this, how we try to understand it and how we come to work out what this means for us. And that's quite different, and that's quite a slow process. And some organisations were very quick at putting in well-being for their staff. I mean, for those of us that were lucky enough to work in Reading, our chief exec and local organisations were fabulous. They got an online supermarket. We were able to get shower rooms and sleep pods as sort of porta cabin type things on the playing fields of the school across the road immediately, so that we had increased the ability to rinse the COVID off you before you went home. And for people who had a long commute, they could book a pod and stay there. And there was help for people who were trying to keep away from their families because they had vulnerable household members. And empathetic leaders recognise that this sort of situation can put individuals into a crisis. And transition isn't the outcome, but it's the endings that people have when they leave that old situation behind. And I think this is really important and really pertinent today, and one that certainly bears some thought about. And for the organisations that you work in, the light bulb moment is that change and sustained change is only going to be successful if the transition that individual people experience during the change is supported, and you don't just push it through like an army general saying this is non-negotiable. Sure, in an emergency situation, you might have to do some things very, very quickly. And certainly as a clinical director saying, we've got to do this. It's like, you know, doctors, very junior doctors, you know, foundation and some ST1s being redeployed to the respiratory wards, for example. Yes, we've got to push that because we've actually got to staff the place to look after the patients, but we've got to support the people that we have displaced. We've got to support you and your worries about what this does to your training, for example, and whether you might need longer in training. And so DMEs, associate deans, postgraduate deans, the Royal Colleges, they're all looking at this and working out how we might, for example, fund prolonged training in some specialties for some people who've been particularly impacted and lost out on things. Burnout we've sort of touched on. The triad of symptoms for burnout are exhaustion, inefficiency, and cynicism. And again, if you do a little sort of self-inventory, you know, all of us might feel this for a short period of time from time to time. You might feel this particularly if you've done a weekend or a long stretch of nights. But if it's more days than not, is this burnout? Quite possibly. And you prevent it, or you start your recovery from burnout by prioritising self-care. And psychologists say these are the 5 things that we need to address. So our sleep, what we're shoving in our mouths, how much we're moving around, social connection, which again, certainly in first lockdown was, you know, everything was done on Teams and Zoom, wasn't it? And not seeing actual people. And practices that promote equanimity and well-being. So that is that. And that is almost the last slide. This is effectively the last slide, which is, have I more or less covered your learning objectives? In my delusional fantasy, I think I have touched on all of these and given you all some signposting to leadership, professionalism, diversity, team working, a little bit of human factors. My last slide, my futile attempt to find a various diverse group of people. It's not very, but the question here is, do you have anything you want to ask me before you all scramble off and have lunch? I'm going to get rid of my show and bring you all back.
So thank you so much, Jane. Lots of food for thought, something different as well.
Yeah,
to engage us all with.
Well, it is. It's the non-technical skills of being a doctor, isn't it?
Yeah. So Shafi, I think that must be an old hand, unless
it's an old hand or a new hand, Shafi?
A new hand.
Oh, sorry, that's an old hand.
That's right.